I grew up around farms, but I'd never worked on one full-time until last spring, when I took a farmhand job outside Grinnell. I was 23 then, in that weird stage of life where you're too old to be drifting, but too unsure of yourself to stop. My cousin knew a guy named Ray Mendel who owned a small cattle and goat operation east of town. Ray needed an extra pair of hands for calving season and general upkeep. I needed money and a place to be left alone. That's how I ended up spending most days on a windswept property with a few dozen goats, 20-some head of cattle, and an old red barn that creaked in the wind no matter how still the air was. The barn was the kind of structure you'd expect to collapse years ago. 2 stories, warped siding, and a roof patched with mismatched sheets of tin. It held together, though. Ray said his grandfather built it in 1938, and that old bastard built everything to outlive him. I believed it. I'd grown used to climbing the ladder up to the loft, tossing hay bales down, and shoveling grain dust into feed buckets. Goats are loud, stubborn, and nosy. I learned that fast. They'd chew on your shoelaces, headbutt you when you weren't paying attention, and bleat like they were auditioning for some rural opera. Every now and then, foxes or coyotes would slip through the perimeter fence and try their luck, but the goats were feisty, and Ray was diligent with repairs. Still, we lost 1 or 2 every few months. Nothing strange about that. But one night, something else came for the goats. Something no sane person ever expects to see outside of a horror movie. It was late, close to 10 p.m., when Ray sent me out to lock up the barn. A storm had passed earlier, dropping the temperature into the low 40s, the kind of cold that sinks into your sleeves and reminds you Iowa Springs can still bite. I walked the path from the farmhouse to the barn with a flashlight in one hand and an aluminum gate latch in the other. Everything smelled like wet earth and hay. The goats bleated from inside the barn, unsettled for reasons I couldn't place yet. When I flicked on the overhead lights in the lower level, one problem stood out instantly. The herd, normally clustered around the feed troughs, was pressed into the farthest corner, as if something had herded them there. Their ears were flat, their eyes wide. Goats aren't subtle when they're scared. All right, what's got into you all? I murmured to myself. Then I noticed that one was missing. One particular goat, a black and white nanny named Myrtle. Myrtle was bold, loud, and unusually fond of chewing on shirt sleeves. Her absence hit me like a wrong chord. I scanned the stalls, the shadows, the feed bins. Nothing. Then I heard a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from above me, the loft. I called out, "Myrtle?" Even though I knew goats don't climb ladders. But the noise, that scraping, like claws or hooves dragging lightly along old wooden boards, came again. I didn't want to climb that ladder. I remember that feeling clearly, a sudden, primal sense of dread, as if the air in the barn had somehow thickened. But duty, pride, stupidity, whatever mix of things makes a farmhand keep working when he shouldn't, pushed me upward. The ladder creaked beneath my boots. My flashlight beam trembled across the rafters until I pulled myself onto the loft floor. The smell hit me first. Not the musky, sharp tang of goat bedding I was used to, but something entirely different, thick, wet, and rotten. It rolled over me in a wave so strong it felt physical, like stepping into an invisible wall of decay. It was the smell of meat left out far too long, of something dead that hadn't had the courtesy to stay still. Beneath it lurked an animal stink, hot breath, damp fur, something primal and carnivorous that didn't belong in a barn at all. It was so overpowering that it drowned out every familiar scent of hay and livestock until all that remained was the undeniable presence of death. But still, I kept going. My light caught something smeared across the floorboards, a dark streak leading toward the stacked hay bales. There was a shape on the ground. I moved closer. It was Myrtle, or what was left of her. She'd been torn open in a way no coyote could manage. No dog either. Not that a canine would be able to get there anyway. At least not a normal one. Her ribs were spread unnaturally wide, her internal organs pulled aside and exposed. It was violence mixed with intent. My breath stalled in my throat. Then something large moved in the shadows behind the bales. At first I thought it was a person, some sicko who got off on killing helpless animals. The shape was crouched low, its back angled, shoulders rising and falling, like it was breathing heavily. My flashlight caught something glistening, wet fur matted with fresh blood, muscles rippling beneath as it turned toward the light. The beam illuminated a hand-like paw dragging stringy meat into what might have been a deformed mouth. But as my flashlight slid higher, the truth crystallized in a moment of pure, cold terror. This wasn't a human being. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen in this world. It rose, slowly, quietly, until it stood at its full height. The thing towered over me, 7 feet at least, maybe more. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur that caught the light in uneven patches, matted in some places, bristling in others, with bare skin showing through like diseased earth. The shoulders were monstrous, broad, muscle-corded, and its arms hung long enough for its curved black claws to graze its knees. The head, God. It looked like a wolf at first glance, but larger, bulkier, and perverted by hints of humanity that made the whole thing look even more wrong. The forehead was steep and rounded, and the eyes were buried under heavy brows. It seemed almost grotesque. The muzzle was covered in gore, and when the creature lifted its chin, strands of red dripped onto the hay beneath its feet. Its eyes reflected the flashlight's beam in a yellow-white glow. The pupils were focused, calculating, fixed entirely on me. I was completely frozen. Every instinct I had screamed to get out, climb down, run for my life, but I couldn't move. My body simply refused. The creature took a step toward me. The loft boards groaned under its weight. I stumbled backward until my heel found empty air. I nearly fell down the ladder. Only a desperate grab at a loft post saved me. The creature advanced another step, nostrils flaring as it drew in my scent. A low growl vibrated through the barn, low enough that I felt it in my bones more than I heard it. "No, no, no!" I gasped, scrambling for the ladder. The creature lunged. The moment it made its move, I dropped down the ladder so fast I burned my palms on the rungs. I was already halfway down when a shadow blotted out the faint light above me. I saw it fly through the air right over me, a huge, dark mass crossing the space where my head had been not even a heartbeat earlier. Its claws sliced through empty air less than a foot above my scalp, close enough that I felt the rush of wind off its massive body. It hit the barn wall with a deafening crash, causing the entire structure to vibrate and sending flakes of dust and old paint cascading down on my face like brittle snow. The instant my boots hit the ground, I tore away from the ladder and sprinted for the barn doors. I could hear the creature scramble upstairs, probably righting itself to come after me. I cleared the barn doors, slammed them shut, and threw the latch without thinking. Not half a second later, something hit the interior of the doors, hard. The wood bowed outward, the hinges groaned, but the latch held. Something, a hand, a claw, dragged across the wooden surface with a scraping noise that burned itself into my memory. The goats in the barn were going mad. For a second, I felt bad for them. But then my survival instincts won out. Maybe the goats would keep it busy long enough for me to escape. Better them than me. I ran a beeline from the barn towards the house, flashlight shaking in my hands, waiting for it to burst out behind me. It didn't. In fact, the sounds faded altogether. Ray answered the door, half asleep. "Jesus, kid. What's wrong?" I must have looked pale. I could barely get the words out. "Something's in the barn," I said. "It killed Myrtle. It's huge, upright, like a werewolf. I don't know what the hell it is, Ray, but it's still in there." Ray blinked at me, measuring whether I was drunk, insane, or something in between. When he saw my shaking hands, he seemed to realize something serious had happened. "All right," he said calmly. "Go to my truck. Grab the shotgun from the rack. We're going to take a look." The walk back felt longer. My feet dragged. The moon was high and bright, but the barn still looked like a shadow waiting to swallow us. Ray fumbled with the latch for a second, then swung the barn doors wide open without a care in the world. Nothing. The goats were still trembling in the corner, but other than that, the barn was perfectly quiet. "Up there," I said, pointing to the loft. Ray didn't hesitate, didn't even pause to let me explain. He just motioned for me to stay behind him and started climbing the ladder with one hand while clutching the shotgun in the other, like he was checking a squeaky hinge, not stalking something that had nearly torn me in half. I stared up at him, dumbfounded. The man was either fearless or insane. The ladder creaked under his weight, and each sound made my pulse spike. My mind kept replaying the image of that massive shape flying over me, those claws slicing the air just above my head. I knew exactly how fast that thing could move, how silently it could reposition, how easily it could tear through flesh. So when Ray reached the halfway point, I had to look away. I just couldn't watch. I fully expected, honestly expected, to hear a growl, a scream, the thud of his body hitting the floor. I turned my eyes to the barn wall instead, bracing myself for the sound of Ray being ripped apart just a few feet from me. When he reached the loft, he stopped. He didn't call down to me, didn't move, didn't even shift his footing. He just went utterly still, like he'd walked face first into something the mind needs a second to process. "Well, hell," he muttered at last, but his voice was more confused than anything. It was low, tight, almost strangled, like the words were being dragged out of him. I couldn't see what exactly he was looking at from where I stood, but it was not the reaction I expected from someone face to face with a 7-foot werewolf beast. "Kid, get up here. I need you to run me through everything you saw up here." My stomach dropped. I didn't want to go up there. I knew what waited there wasn't meant for human eyes, but the way he said it left no room for refusal. I hesitated long enough to feel my pulse hammering in my throat, then forced myself toward the ladder. Every rung groaned beneath me, each one feeling like it might be my last. And the whole time I kept telling myself, if that thing was still up here, Ray would be dead already, so it was probably gone. I was right. The boards upstairs were still stained with fresh blood. The smell of death still hung thick in the air, but the werewolf was gone, and so was Myrtle. Most of her, anyway. A few tufts of fur, a few splintered bone fragments, and some of the intestines were still there, and broad, wet smear dragging toward the open loft door, the one facing the pasture. It was enough to prove that I hadn't imagined it, that something had indeed happened to Myrtle up there, but not enough to make my story truly believable. "You see?" I whispered. "I told you something was up here." Ray crouched, examining the marks in the floor. I knew they were claw marks, but to someone who hadn't seen that creature, it wasn't conclusive. Ray pressed his lips together. "Yeah," he admitted. "Something was here, or someone. But you're telling me a werewolf did this? Come on, kid. It must have been some pervert, maybe even one in a costume. That was no damn animal. Coyotes, dogs, and bears can't get up here. Certainly not with a full-grown goat in their mouth. You panicked and filled the blanks with monsters." I shook my head. "It wasn't a man in a costume, Ray. Can't you smell it? The rot? No human being smells like that." He didn't argue that, but his silence told me everything. He didn't buy it, not even close. Ray looked around the loft, over the scattered blood, then back at me. "Whatever it was, it's gone now. Nothing we can do about the goat. I'll head to town tomorrow and stop by the sheriff's office. Then I'll get some motion sensor lights and maybe even a couple of cameras. Can't have someone come onto my property slaughtering the goats." I just shook my head. I felt powerless. There was nothing I could do to convince him that I was telling the truth. The next morning, while the sun was still climbing over the pastures and Ray was getting ready to head into town, I packed my duffel, headed to the car, and took off. No note, no goodbye. I couldn't stay another night in a place where something like that was running around at night. I drove away from Grinnell and never looked back. To this day, whenever I pass a barn with a loft, I feel the hair rise on my arms. Some things you don't unsee. In rural Iowa, we like to think we know every creature on the land, but that night proved to me we don't. My name's Ben. I'm not the kind of man who scares easily. 8 years as a ranger in the Army, including 2 tours in the Middle East, tend to beat the fear out of you or teach you how to choke it down until the job's done. When I left the service, I wanted quiet, a patch of land, a few animals, some peace, and distance from people. That's how I ended up outside Decorah, Iowa, on 15 acres of pasture with chickens, horses, and my 2 dogs, Bear and Timber. The encounter I'm about to describe happened 3 years ago, in early November. The weather was cooling fast, nights getting long. I had settled into the routine, check the fence lines at dusk, feed the horses, let the dogs burn off steam while I stowed my tools for the night and locked everything up. Nothing strange, nothing remarkable, until that night. That night, something stepped out of the woods behind my barn, and for the first time since Afghanistan, I felt a primal, instinctive awareness that I was in danger, real danger, the kind that most people never experience. I'd just finished throwing hay for the horses when I heard something entirely out of place, a long, rolling howl that carried across the pasture like it belonged to something way too large to be native to this part of the country. It wasn't a coyote. Coyotes have a yipping, frantic tone. This was deeper, resonant, almost mournful, but with a force behind it that vibrated in my chest. I doubt that even a wolf could have made that sound unless it weighed north of 300 pounds. My hands froze instantly on the hay bale. I lifted my head toward the direction I thought the howl had come from, but at first all I saw was darkness, just a wall of pine and oak swallowing the edge of my property. Then something shifted in the dark. 2 small, glowing orbs appeared in the brush right behind the barn. Initially, I had no idea what I was looking at. Then something detached itself from the tree line, stepping into the open space between the barn and the house. It moved with a smooth deliberateness that made my skin crawl, like it already knew exactly how this was going to play out. When it finally stepped out of the shadows and entered the moonlight, I thought, just for a moment, that it was a man. A tall man with a huge frame, but then it kept rising, straightening, unfolding. The moonlight caught on a shoulder that jutted out at least a foot wider than any human frame I'd ever seen. Its arms dangled past where knees should be, fingers splayed with what looked like curved daggers at each tip. Every inch it gained told me the proportions were wrong. Limbs too elongated, joints bending at angles that defied anatomy. The silhouette sharpened into something that wasn't human at all, a grotesque parody of our form. Then its head came into view, emerging from hunched shoulders like a nightmare surfacing from dark water. It carried the profile of a canid, but perched on top of a body that looked like some kind of upright walking primate, bare-chested, with skin that seemed to ripple like oil-slick water over dense muscle. Its torso tapered from massive shoulders to a narrower waist, each breath visibly shifting the plates of its chest. Its muzzle was elongated and angular, covered in short black fur that caught the moonlight in a blue-silver sheen. The bridge of its nose pronounced like a wolf's, but wider, flatter. The head was massive and looked heavy as a cinder block, set above a neck corded with tendons thick as my thumb. The ears were short but sharply pointed, twitching and swiveling independently, the pink inner flesh visible when they rotated toward me, like radar dishes scanning for the slightest rustle of my clothing or hitch in my breath. Even from about 80 feet away, I could see the subtle flex of its jaw, the way its lips twitched back just far enough to expose teeth better suited for tearing than chewing. And the eyes, they were reflective, intelligent, and cold, assessing me the same way my dogs examine a freshly cooked steak on my dinner plate. I knew immediately that I was deep in the shit. I was out in the open, unarmed. All my guns were in the house, and that thing just so happened to stand right between me and the front door. I hadn't fired a single shot during the 2 years I'd lived out there. There was simply no need to carry a gun around the property. I tried to think of something, anything. The back door was on the far side of the house and locked. No way was I going to make it inside without getting torn apart by this wolf man. Yes, I know how it sounds, but that's what this thing looked like. Every square inch of its body screamed werewolf. Then that damn thing dropped to all fours and charged. I'll be honest, I've been shot at, I've been ambushed, I've fought hand to hand in alleys and compounds, but the sight of that thing barreling toward me tapped into something older than training, something wired into the bone. And then it suddenly skidded to a halt, as quickly as it had picked up speed just seconds earlier. The creature hesitated and cocked its head to the side. That's when Bear and Timber burst around the corner of the chicken coop behind me, exploding onto the open with deep, thunderous barks that immediately shattered the stillness. I hadn't even heard them coming. They must have sprinted the entire length of the property the moment they sensed the danger. The two massive dogs tore up the dirt as they skidded across the moist grass on my right, bodies rigid, tails high, hackles raised so sharply it looked like their spines had bristled into two jagged saw blades. Timber planted himself right in front of me, not showing an ounce of fear, even though that thing in front of him was at least twice his size. Bear stayed close to my leg, pressing himself against my pants as if to reassure me of his presence. They were both ready for a fight, but neither dog charged. They held the line, forming a living barrier between me and whatever the hell had found its way on my quiet piece of land. The werewolf also started growling and pushed itself upright again, then spread out its impossibly long arms, trying to make itself look as big and dangerous as possible. But it didn't come closer. For a few moments, we were all locked in this weird standoff, with everyone but me growling as loudly as they could. At that point, I was sure things were about to get ugly. My pulse didn't spike, but a cold clarity washed over me, the same kind that comes right before a firefight. I scanned my surroundings, looking for anything with reach or weight, and my eyes landed on the hay fork leaning against the barn wall. I lunged for it, grabbed it firmly with both hands, and swung back into position beside my boys. I leveled the tines at the creature's chest, ready to drive the cold steel straight through its flesh if it even twitched in our direction. If this abomination wanted a fight, then by God, I was going to give it one. The werewolf didn't seem so sure of itself anymore. Its growls wavered, just slightly, but enough for a trained eye to see hesitation creeping into its stance. The first crack in the facade of absolute confidence it had charged at me with just moments earlier. For a few more seconds, it held its ground, chest heaving, claws extended, eyes darting between the dogs and me like it was running the numbers in its crooked head. Then, in one smooth, frustrated motion, it started to back up, never turning away from us. Its eyes stayed locked on mine the whole time, as though memorizing my face or maybe warning me that this wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Then it turned around, dropped to all fours, and ran. It disappeared into the trees without a sound. The dogs stayed in a full alert stance for nearly a minute after it vanished. Only when they finally relaxed did I lower the fork. My hands were steady, my breathing was even, but I felt the enormity of what had just happened settle into my bones. Whatever that thing was, it was smart enough to weigh the odds of attacking a man who didn't give an inch and two giant dogs, and decided it wasn't worth the fight. That meant it was smart. That meant it wasn't some freak mutation or rabid animal. It was something that understood risk and reward, and I was going to use that against it. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid. I've lived with fear before, but because I was making plans. I got lucky, plain and simple. If the dogs hadn't noticed that thing at just the right moment, I would have been ripped apart by it. Something like that was not going to happen again. At first light, I drove into town. I bought 11 heavy-duty bear traps, their entire stock, enough motion sensor lights to cover everything from the back porch to the chicken coop, and more barbed wire than any sane man should ever need. I was going to turn my place into a goddamn fortress. Guns weren't an issue. I already owned more than most rural sheriff's departments. My concern wasn't firepower. It was being caught off guard. I spent the entire day reinforcing the perimeter, mounting lights, and placing traps in the underbrush along the edge of the woods. The barbed wire fence was strong enough to at least slow that thing down and make it bleed before it ever set foot on my land. It also prevented the dogs from stepping into my traps. Those things could do serious damage to a paw or a snout. My boys shadowed me the whole time, their noses working the air like they expected that thing to reappear. But it never did. Not that night. Not that week. Not ever again. I don't know if it decided I wasn't worth the trouble and moved on to easier prey, or someone else had taken it down and never talked about it. Just about everyone out here had guns and didn't hesitate to use them. Out here, suspicion comes easy, and pulling a trigger comes even easier. That thing had picked the wrong damn state as its hunting ground. My name is Joe Watterson, and I am 63 years old. I've lived on the same farm in eastern Iowa, just a few miles from the Illinois border, for most of my life. A few years ago, I sold most of my land and focused purely on hay production, a modest supplement to my meager retirement savings, and it keeps me busy and gives me a reason to get up every morning. I've worked the fields since long before many of you were born. I know every inch of my property, every low spot in the pasture, every stretch of fence that needs patching more often than it should. I thought I'd seen everything Iowa could possibly throw at me. I was wrong. What I'm about to share happened in early September last year, right before the second cutting. The weather had been dry, and the grass came in thinner than usual, but I still needed to mow the perimeter of the big field where the trees stretch along the east side. It was getting late in the day, but I wanted to get that pass done before heading in. I hooked the mower attachment to the tractor, let the engine warm up, and started working along the tree line like I had 100 times before. That John Deere is old but reliable, a sturdy machine I've kept running with duct tape, grease, and stubbornness for 3 decades. I remember thinking the woods were unusually quiet that day. Normally the birds kick up when the mower starts moving, and the rabbits bolt for cover. Instead, everything seemed still. The only sound was the steady hum of the old engine and the rhythmic chopping of the mower blades behind me. I didn't give it much thought. Sometimes nature just decides to be quiet for no reason at all. I kept the tractor at a steady pace and focused on the line I wanted to cut. I'm too old for GPS and all that crap. I had almost reached the corner where the fence dips before turning north when something moved in the shadows to my right. I caught it only in my peripheral vision at first, just a dark blur pacing the tractor. I slowed a little, assuming it might be a deer or a hog frightened by the noise, but it didn't run from the tractor. It moved towards it. Before I had time to turn my head fully, the thing came out of the trees and ran straight toward me with a speed and determination that made no sense for any animal I knew. What kind of creature makes a run at heavy machinery? The thing was huge. When it hit the side of the tractor, the whole cab rocked hard enough that I thought a tire had blown out. I instinctively braced myself against the wheel. The thing didn't bounce off. It latched on. I felt the tractor shift slightly as its weight hooked onto the metal railing beside the cab door. I turned fully and saw a shape I still have trouble explaining. The first thing I really saw was the face on the other side of the driver's door, less than 4 feet from mine. That sight alone struck the fear of God into me. The head was an abomination, the kind of thing your mind tries to reject before you can make sense of it. It looked a little like a bear at first glance, but only in the roughest way. Shorter muzzle, broader across the forehead, and with an unevenness to it that made it seem deformed, like nature had started with the right idea but quit halfway through. The eyes were set deep beneath heavy brows, almost human in the way they locked onto mine. The shoulders on both sides of that head were wrong as well. Definitely more human than animal, squared and powerful, nothing like those of a bear or a canine. For a moment, all I could do was stare at it, frozen in disbelief that anything shaped like that could even exist. Then the rest of it came into view, big, strong, and fast, with long arms that ended in hands or paws, I'm still not sure which, able to wrap completely around the railing. It wasn't just hanging on. It was hauling itself upward like a man, with a clear intention, dragging its weight toward the cab like it fully meant to come inside with me. I didn't have a gun on me, and there wasn't anything within reach except the steering wheel and the old fire extinguisher behind the seat. Fighting it directly wasn't an option. The only thing I had was the machine itself. I slammed the wheel hard to the left, The tractor lurched violently, and the thing's grip slipped for a moment, but it managed to hang on. I jerked the wheel the opposite way, then back again, swinging the tractor from side to side across the open field. The mower behind me whined sharply as the sudden changes in direction strained the hitch, but I didn't have time to worry about the equipment. The creature's claws scraped against the cab glass as it tried to climb up further while keeping its hold on the railing with the other hand. Every scrape rattled through the frame and into my bones. I kept jerking the wheel harder and harder, hoping the sudden movements would throw it off. The tractor bucked across the uneven ground, tires slamming into ruts and tufts of dry grass as I fought to keep control. I'm surprised I didn't roll the thing. The beast clung on with a stubborn strength I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. At some point during all this, the tractor reached the open stretch of pasture where the ground flattened out. I knew this was my last chance to shake the thing off before I had to slow down and do a U-turn. I planted my boots on the floor, tightened my grip, and swung the wheel as hard as I could manage. The tractor fishtailed, the rear tires kicking up dirt. I felt a sudden shift in weight as the thing finally lost its grip. It didn't fall away from the tractor like I expected. Instead, it tumbled backward directly into the path of the mower. Before I knew what was happening, it was already over. I looked back just long enough to see one of the creature's feet get caught up in the massive blade. I didn't feel or hear anything as the mower tore through bone and flesh. I saw its jaws open in what looked like a cry of agony, and the creature's body twisted frantically as it tried to pull itself away. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy the sight. I did. A deep, genuine smile lit up my face, a testament to the relief that washed over me for having survived. I watched the creature limp away towards the woods as fast as its mangled leg would carry it, while taking my foot off the gas. I turned the machine around and made a beeline for the house. When I finally parked the tractor, I sat for a moment with the engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised me. Mostly, I felt drained, like someone had sucked the energy out of my old limbs. I checked the mower once I shut everything off. Other than a bit of dried blood on the frame, there wasn't anything to see there. I looked around for the creature, but it was gone, and I wasn't eager to head back out and look for it. Based on what I had seen, the damage its leg had suffered was enough to convince me it wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. That night, I stayed inside with the doors locked and every light on. I didn't call anyone or report it. I didn't have the words to explain what happened, and I sure as hell wasn't gonna make a fool of myself in front of the whole damn county. People out here love nothing more than to gossip. I told myself it must have been some kind of freak animal, maybe a sick bear, even though I knew deep down that I was bullshitting myself. That didn't line up with what I saw one bit. But I'm old. I've got better things to do than scour the internet for an explanation. I'm only sharing this because people have a right to know what's out there. I own plenty of guns, so I wasn't too worried about my own safety, even if it did survive and decided to come back at some point. I'd just have to be more careful in the future and carry serious firepower whenever I went out. But it's been over a year now, and whatever that thing was, it hasn't shown its face again. I still keep my guns close and I don't go out without a holster, but life on the farm isn't too bad these days. The days feel normal again, and even the nightmares have finally stopped. Maybe it died from its injury, or maybe it just realized that my fields aren't the place to go looking for trouble.